Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus, episode 41. I am the show's host, Kyle, and I think episode 40 was great. I saw some pretty good download numbers from that episode and a few shares, so thanks to everybody who shared the show and listened to the show. I hope I got a few repeating viewers, and I hope 41 is just as good as 40. Today's show will focus more on current events. I know I said that it was going to be the last show, but I start ranting and couldn't stop. So today we're going to try to hit a bunch of current events going on in the world of foreign policy. There is quite a bit going on right now. Trump did meet with Erdogan. We got Nikki Haley talking at the UN. A bunch of stuff going on in Africa. I really have been trying to follow the story going on in Africa a little bit better. I feel like there's not a whole lot of people out there who do that, even in the anti-war, non-interventionist community. And so I just want to be sure that I'm bringing everybody the news that I can coming out of Africa, dealing with armed conflicts, Israel stuff, U.S. diplomat in Israel stuff, actually. That's a pretty cool story we'll get into. U.S. State Department memos not reflecting U.S. State Department policy, and a few other things. So we'll get on with it. The first thing I have to say is some very good news, and that is Chelsea Manning was released from prison today. While not strictly foreign policy news, maybe not anymore, the whole story originated with the U.S. War crimes in Afghanistan, I believe maybe Iraq as well. Then Private Bradley Manning was in a position where he witnessed and found out a bunch of U.S. war crimes going on, and unable to had a conscience and wasn't gonna, he thought maybe exposing it to the American people will wake him up and demand our troops come home. But at the same time, if you know about a murder and you have a very strong conscience, I think you're gonna be the person that has to say something about the murder, even if that will make you a target, by the person you're exposing as a murderer. And so what Chelsea was, give all this information to WikiLeaks, who then published that information. Well, it certainly did not have the desired effect of immediately ending the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. I think it did take a lot of air out of that bubble, and it really did. I think that was part of the shift in the view Americans have on the policy of the war on terror, especially the occupations in Iraq and Afghanistan. I remember Barack Obama ran on a policy that we were bringing the troops home, and this is how he got elected, and Trump certainly got elected on a policy of American first. And so these ideas are popular, and part of that popularity has to be because of the important information that Chelsea Manning exposed. So I hope Chelsea is now is able to live whatever life she wishes to live. I don't know if she wants a life in the public eye and wants to talk out against the U.S. government, but if she does, awesome. I would love to see a now freed Chelsea Manning going out and just absolutely trashing the hypocrisy of the U.S. foreign policy and the immorality of the U.S. foreign policy. But if that doesn't happen, and if she just wants a quiet life where she could be able to live out the life of a normal person, that's completely okay. And if so, I wish her all the best in achieving that goal. So yeah, we get to start out the show with some good news today. We ended the last show with some good news, and so good things do happen, especially when we make a lot of noise about it. I think at the end of the day, even a democracy, and I have my feelings on democracy and don't think the political systems work really well, but I do think that at this point in time, the American citizens do, have a lot of power, and telling the politicians no, and that, if you seriously make the threat that you will lose your office if you do this immoral thing or that immoral thing, they will back off and back down. We saw that in 2013. I think we saw that with Obama's clemency of Chelsea Manning. I think for a lot of his base on the progressive left, I think this, was something that he almost had to give him. Since he couldn't close Guantanamo Bay, I think he had to kind of follow through on this one. So good things do happen, and let's continue to make noise, and hopefully we could make some more good things happen. Now to the rest of the news for today, which unfortunately is not as uplifting as the first story. We have Nikki Haley coming out, making statements at the UN saying that the rest of the world is either with the United States or against the international community when it comes to the future applications of sanctions on North Korea. This sounds an awful lot like Bush's "if you're not with us, you're against us" speech. Luckily, I guess it doesn't carry quite as much weight because 9/11 wasn't a couple years ago, and because Nikki Haley isn't George W. Bush. However, I do think it is just part of the disturbing trend of the U.S. really wanting to put more and more pressure on China to comply with with the U.S. sanctions and U.S. desires on North Korea. I think it's pretty obvious that these statements are directed mostly at China, maybe a little bit at Russia. I don't know who else is an ally that even supports North Korea. I mean, you may have states, I don't even know what Iran's policy on North Korea is, but if Iran is sympathetic to North Korea as being a state bullied around by the United States, who has a lot of sanctions on them, then that would certainly be understandable, but I'm sure North Korea isn't able to give or Iran isn't able to give North Korea, or the other way around, any real support. There's an awful lot of land mileage between the two countries, and while you may think that a lot of that is occupied by China and Russia, that's certainly so, but the U.S. has an awful lot of satellites, so I would doubt there's any major support going on between those two countries. And even the premise of Homeland this past year was Iran developing a parallel nuclear program with North Korea, which just seemed laughable to me, because how often could a Iranian even get to North Korea to see how the weapons program is going on? I mean, you would have to base a whole lot of that on faith, and then at the Iran doesn't have the missiles they need to use to equip a nuclear bomb on, so now you have to smuggle a whole North Korean nuclear missile and nuclear warhead from North Korea to Iran. This doesn't even seem possible. What are they thinking? And that's always funny and jokey to me when there's pretends to be an alliance. And of course that started with Bush putting North Korea and Iran in the axis of evil. And so one of the more disturbing parts about the Haley story this time would be that we now know, after the State Department memo saying that Haley has to run all statements on important issues through the State Department, that this policy likely at least reflects the policy of the State Department, but probably represents the thinking of Trump on North Korea. I guess I was holding out some hope before that maybe Trump wasn't all that involved in the North Korean policy and was really just letting his officials do what they wanted, because when he came out and talked about North Korea, it sounded a lot more dovish than everybody else. Of course, Trump saying that he was willing to talk to Kim Jong-un. And you had the actual diplomats, Haley and Tillerson, refusing to talk to the North Korean delegation. So, a second story on North Korea that I found interesting was that only 37% of Americans could find North Korea on a map. At least this was the results of some polling done, I believe, by the New York Times. So I guess the first thing I will say is I think this is often used to be like, look how stupid Americans are, but why would Americans really care where some hermit kingdom is across the other side of the globe on, the little tail end of Russia and China? It seems to me that the activities in that region of the world should be relatively irrelevant to the people who live in the middle part of North America. And now, if you want to be a cultured person and you're a world traveler, or if there's like certain beautiful sights to see in North Korea, well then that would maybe make sense to know some things about the country. But short of, a family member happening, rather than going to France, going to North Korea, I don't know why you should even really know where the country is. However, because we have the U.S. government putting North Korea in the axis of evil, and of course the Korean War that started in the 50s, and apparently nobody could still let go of it today. And so you just have this multi-general conflict going on between these two cultures, and at least people in the American culture can't find the people in Korea on a map, and I would doubt that North Koreans could probably find America on a map. Kim Jong-un's textbooks for this are probably have the America looking like a skull and crossbone ring of fire type of place on the other side of the world. And I guess it's amazing to me that the Americans would support and be okay with military action against North Korea, or support sanctions against North Korea, support sanctions against North Korea that starve civilians, right? There's a lot of people who say that nobody should give North Korea aid of any time, and yet these people can't even find North Korea on a map. And so it would seem to me, though, that if you were the type of person that was advocating for starving a population, you better be able to find those people on a map. And I think this goes probably against what I said at the beginning of the show, that things can get better. I think this is where we have to worry about things getting worse, because Americans are just so apathetic to the foreign policy news that they just let the government do whatever they want. And it results in a situation where we're now potentially going to war with North Korea, this country on the other side of the globe that doesn't have a missile that could reach the United States, that their arch enemies, South Korea, is more friendly towards North Korea than the U.S. I mean, you have President Moon in South Korea, who are supposed to be the arch enemies of North Korea, saying that he wants to talk to North Korea, and so his approach to North Korea is a whole lot hawkish than ours, and it's really unbelievable. I want to cover some stories about Africa. Like I said, I am trying to stay more on top of some of the stuff going on in Africa. I had talked about the hunt for Joseph Kony ending, and this was kind of the end of U.S. military intervention against Boko Haram, at least for now, maybe. Who knows, that we could still be carrying out operations against Boko Haram in a different African country. And so we had a case where Ugandan soldiers were a country coming in and looking for Joseph Kony, and then working with the U.S. advisory and assist special forces. What ends up happening is that some of these Ugandan soldiers committed war crimes, raping and sexually assaulting women who were just innocent civilians. I believe 15 or 16 of these women actually became pregnant and now are unsupported, unwed mothers living with a child of their rapist invader from a different country. And so that has to be a pretty tough position to be in. And it certainly creates more hostilities between the two countries, because obviously this is something that will be pretty big news in that country. The probable lack of justice that will come to these soldiers will also create hostilities. I really doubt we will see any of them prosecuted in any serious way. They certainly will not face a punishment worthy of their crimes. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, we have a small outbreak of Ebola, killing 3 people so far. The only reason this is really foreign policy news is the last time there was an outbreak of Ebola, I think Obama deployed 100 troops in 3 different countries. So anytime it's a troop deployment, it's an issue. I'm not quite sure why Obama would have sent troops for this issue, but maybe it was a point where they were running some martial law procedures over there and how to quarantine and lock down countries, and maybe U.S. troops have some specialties in that. I don't know if anybody knows exactly what U.S. troops end up doing to fight Ebola. You could let me know, but that should be one on the face of it where Americans really push back, because you should say, what are you going to do? Shoot a virus? Seems insane. An update on the mutiny in the Ivory Coast. So as I documented, I believe in the last 2 episodes, there's about 8,600 Ivory Coast soldiers rebelling against the government because the government was unable to pay the soldiers bonuses they promised the soldiers. I believe these soldiers fought in a war on behalf of the government, and then the government kind of went back on promises to pay the soldiers. The soldiers then rebelled, made a deal with the government, and then the government's been unable to follow up on that deal. In one city, we had civilians go into the streets and try to, physically push back and just walk the rebelling soldiers out of their town. However, this didn't work. 1 civilian died and 6 were wounded. We do have government soldiers loyal to the government advancing on the main town that the rebels are holding. This is the 2nd largest city in the Ivory Coast, and then the largest city in the Ivory Coast, the country's capital. There has been some gunshots heard outside the city, and this is apparently related to the fighting. I'll keep everybody up to date on what's going on here and what the eventual resolution, hopefully there's a resolution of this situation is. I'm not sure what could be done, but it's not even a lot of money the soldiers are asking for. I guess the Ivory Coast has a pretty inflated currency, because they're getting 12 million each in their country's currency, but that only works out to 15,000 euros or something. And so, I mean, I'm sure relatively it's a lot, but I mean, we could have a war fought over a couple million euros here. I also want to mention refugee flows to Europe. There's been a few stories coming out recently about refugee boats capsizing. I've pointed this out several times, in that these smugglers are really, really evil people, and they'll throw all these people on very overfilled boats. Those boats will end up sinking or capsizing. I've heard stories of, at times, smugglers putting people on boats with either not enough fuel, or that they knew would break down or had holes in it and would sink, and they really just don't care. They pile them all on the boats, and they, I guess, good luck. They push you off, and hopefully you make it to land on the other side. And so the number of refugees reaching Europe from Libya is up 40% in the past year, and deaths are also up, although not quite by 40%. And so this should just be a reminder that the crises in the Middle East, the wars in the Middle East, are causing more and more people to lose their homes. And of course, in North Africa, these people are flowing into Libya and then trying to flow through the Mediterranean Sea into Italy and then into Europe, looking for some sort of refuge from the wars in their country. And it's just an absolute mess. One story I really want to bring up was that Trump accuses Assad of mass killings. This is the U.S. government repeating the Amnesty International report that came out in January saying that Assad was executing a bunch of prisoners without giving them their day in court and then cremating them on in the facility. There's been some research done on this since it did come out in January. This is very old news and it's been debunked. The only proof they have of this entire story is that they were building a building that would likely be used as a crematorium, and so they say the only reason you would need this is that if you're killing a bunch of people in your prison. However, everybody forgets that over 100,000 troops from the Syrian government have died, and so that's an awful lot of bodies. I'm sure they've killed an awful lot of terrorists. I'm sure there's been a lot of amputations. I'm sure even in the prison there's been a ton of amputations. I'm sure that Assad isn't treating those prisoners well, and I'm sure that there may have been a couple of them that were just taken out back and shot and not given their day in court. However, this idea that there's been tens of thousands of prisoners hung and then thrown into a crematorium seems very unlikely. This seems to be an attempt at propagandizing the U.S. people. I think one of the things that the U.S. always uses to try to drag America into wars where there's clearly no American interest is by comparing that country to Hitler and by creating as much World War II imagery as possible. And the narrative is always that if we would have had to sooner than less, the Jews would have been killed by Hitler. And, I'm not going to argue that point right now. Maybe they're right, maybe they're not. What I will say is that this isn't World War II, and we're not fighting the Nazis, and the people we're fighting for aren't Britain and France, it's jihadists. And so it's a pretty sneaky thing to do, to make those comparisons and to try to use that imagery. And people at Amnesty International, who are really trying to be seen as a group of people who just want the best for the people of the world, and we don't have any government interest here, but they're pushing for a war here, and it's awfully nasty. I also have an article here from Will Porter, who I've talked about in the past and who will be coming on my show. I've had some problems getting my Skype to record, so if anybody knows any troubleshooting on that, you send me an email. But I think I got it figured out. I'm doing a test run tonight, and we'll hopefully be recording with Will shortly. So he puts out an article where Will actually speaks, but definitely reads and writes Arabic, and translated a State Department document that was produced in Arabic, identifying a couple Al-Qaeda offshoots as members of groups linked to Al-Qaeda. The interesting thing about this is that these groups were never formally added to any terrorism list, and it was basically, I think, just a warning to officials to say, like, hey, if you do business with these people, they're jihadists, so they might kidnap you and kill you or something like that. So the U.S. ends up actually arming one of the groups that was warned about in this CIA memo, not directly, but they armed a group who is now a part of this group. And so I believe the group they armed was actually the group that beheaded that 8-year-old boy in the truck a couple years ago. Very creepy video. I wouldn't recommend watching it. The ISIS or the jihadist guy is kind of like petting the boy's head and then just hats it off, and it's really disgusting and some of the worst of humanity. But these are people that the U.S. ends up arming, and then they end up joining one of these groups that the U.S. warned about before, and so now U.S. arms are in a group that their State Department memo identified as a group linked to al-Nusra. Of course, one of the more amazing parts of this story is that many people don't care about the U.S. arming groups linked to Al-Qaeda. This should be, I think, the one issue maybe Americans can legitimately raise, is that Al-Qaeda is a threat to the United States because Al-Qaeda attacked the United States. But we continue to arm Al-Qaeda against Assad, who's never done anything to the U.S. We have a total of 87 Syrian civilians being killed by U.S. airstrikes over the course of 5 days. I believe the 5 days would have been last Friday, so May 12th through Tuesday. I guess that'd be the 17th. I just reckless is all I can say. Obviously, I've talked about blowback so many times, I won't go over it again on this episode, but just how important is it, and how many times over and over do we have to see this come about, where the U.S. will kill a bunch of civilians and call it a win in the war against terror, when obviously all this does every single time is just create more terrorists, and that's why we have more terrorists today than we did on 9/11. And it's clear, it's obvious, and these civilians deserve justice. I wish we could hold President Trump accountable and James Mattis and say, hey, look, if you're going to carry out these airstrikes that kill innocent civilians, then you better be able to justify every single one of them. And I'm sure they absolutely can't, and it would lead to a case where we would have to seriously look at those airstrikes as crimes. An interesting statement out of the Trump administration was that Israel doesn't have a claim to the West Wall, or he said that Israel is occupying the West Wall. The West Wall is a significant landmark in the history for both Jewish people and Muslim people, and it's located in Jerusalem. There's a lot of significance of the wall. I'm not going to get into the whole thing, but the U.S. official said something that was displeasing to the Israeli government. This was, I'm sure, by Israelis perceived as probably a pretty good-sized blow against Israel. It really calls into question the legitimacy of their claim on Jerusalem, and while I'm sure it's not going to amount to anything, I think Israel is going to be awfully upset about it, and this is leading up to Trump's visit to the Middle East. Speaking of Trump's visit to the Middle East, one of the more important things we have going on is the possibility of the formation of an Arab NATO. This story was published in the Washington Post, so it could be completely fake, and if it is, I will make sure to point out on the next episode that the Washington Post duped me on this one, but I think the story is really too important to not address it, because if we could raise some popular support or popular opposition to the idea of an Arab NATO now, then maybe Trump won't bring it up on his trips to Saudi Arabia. I guess the idea would be for the U.S. to create a fighting force among Arab allies. I'm sure this would include Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Oman, Bahrain, probably the government of Lebanon, but maybe not. That may incite Hezbollah a little too much. I'm sure Turkey would be involved, possibly Iraq, possibly Afghanistan. I'm not sure how many of the former Soviet bloc countries would join, but I'm guessing there would be a lot of resistance there of them ending up joining the Arab NATO just from its Russian ties. And so this would seem to be a formal alliance between the U.S. and some very, very violent countries. And I think for the United States, our first thing would just have to be is, do you want to have a mutual pact with a country like Saudi Arabia who oppresses their people? Turkey, which is certainly already a member of NATO and allied with the U.S., but again, do we want to be even deeper involved with a country that sees a large part of its civilian population as terrorists, and we need to call this into question. I think we should hopefully this won't come to be, and that there's enough pushback in the Senate. Thank you, Rand Paul, to prevent this from going through. But very, very dangerous. These countries have very bad intentions in the Middle East, and I think they're certainly looking for domination and suppressing of other people. The Saudi royal family, the UAE royals, certainly continue to get rich while a lot of their people remain in bad situations just as far as standard of living goes, but a lot of people in those countries are very, very oppressed. Of course, they have a lot of oil money, which wouldn't be so much, but then the U.S. goes and subsidizes their whole defense for them, so they have to end up paying very little themselves for a lot of their international actions. This plan also comes with the basically Saudi Arabia buying a ready-made military from the United States. This is a country that has openly admitted that they have supported Wahhabi Sunniism which is the ideology of Al-Qaeda. And so you're buying a country that has given support to Al-Qaeda military. And when you think about the issue of what is best for the American people, I find it hard to believe that giving Saudi Arabia a $300 billion worth of military to be a good idea. And I'm sure this is another case where the U.S. civilians are probably not getting a very good return on their investment. I'm sure a lot of these programs that these weapon makers use for the R&D on these weapons were subsidized by the U.S. taxpayers. The U.S. taxpayers got screwed once when they subsidized the programs. They got screwed again when they had to buy the weapons from these companies like Lockheed Martin. And then now they're going to get screwed a third time by Lockheed Martin getting rich, selling the weapons to Saudi Arabia, who may or may not one day use the weapons against the U.S. You certainly already have the UAE doing that in Libya. And just to update, there hasn't been a whole lot of progress going on in Mosul. It seems like maybe they're going, taking it street by street, door by door. They did open up a new front in northwest West Mosul. I think that this new front is making a little bit of ground because the one moving towards the Great Mosque is just going nowhere. They say they control 90% of the city, but that seems like an overestimate to me. Last story I want to touch on is China and Vietnam agree to try to keep tensions low when it comes to South China Sea issues. Other than the Philippines, who has already in some ways kind of come to terms with China's involvement in the South China Sea, Vietnam was kind of the second biggest country contesting Chinese involvement there. So hopefully this issue is cooling off. I think it's at least worth noting that it seemed like when the U.S. diverted its attention towards North Korea and the Middle East under Trump, unlike Obama, where we are really looking at the area, it seems like that this situation is going to be resolved and tensions are going in the right direction there, which is down. So that's good to see. I think that's all I have for the show today. If everybody liked the show, please share the show. It really helps the show to get out there and grow. We're coming up. We're looking good. I really like what's going on here. I'm very encouraged by it. I really did not expect to have the success in the download numbers that this show is having this early on, and that's all because people are sharing the show. So first, thank you so much, and second, please share again. I got an email that I need to get back to the guy who emailed me, so if you're waiting on an email from me, it's coming soon. If anybody does want to email me, my email is kylesfilesblog@gmail.com. Files is spelled F-Y-L-E-S. I will respond to your email within a few days, I promise, if you do send me an email. I'm on Facebook at Kyle's Files. Files again, F-Y-L-E-S. I do daily news roundups. I really supplement the show, so if you like the show, the news roundups are there for you too. I'm on Twitter at KYAAALE. We have a private Facebook group called Foreign Policy Focus. My website is Kyle's Files Blog at just kylesfilesblog.com. This is my website, not my email address. And all my stuff goes up at the libertarianinstitute.org, so everybody check that out. Thanks, I'll see you Friday.